You know that fleeting second of frustration when you pull on a door's handlebar only to learn it's actually a push? Or the bill notice that's mailed to your house only days after you submitted payment online? Sometimes the systems around us are so complex and convoluted, we just want to burn everything to the ground and start anew. But before you light that match, let's learn why this happens and how we can organize better for the future. To help me with this, I would like to introduce you to someone that had a heavy influence on me at the onset of my career back in 2005, my graduate school advisor and mentor, Professor Robert Glushko. Bob. He is an adjunct professor at the University of California, Berkeley in the Cognitive Science program and has written a number of books, including The Discipline of Organizing, super helpful. Prior to Berkeley, he was an entrepreneurial co-founder of 3 companies and is credited with popularizing XML, which you can think of as a core coding language that helps most of our industries and businesses share information. This is going to be great, but first, welcome to this week's episode of Make Sense, a video podcast that simplifies complex issues at the intersection of tech and people. There are a lot. So whether you're totally hyped on AI and you're ready for the robot takeover, okay, that's you. Or you want to crawl into a cave after deleting all of your social media accounts, I don't blame you. I'm here with my guests to help make sense of what's going on so you can design yourself into the future. My name is Lindsay Tabus, the Lady Engineer. I am a pragmatic futurist and human-first technologist, serial entrepreneur, and innovation consultant. If you're new here, subscribe on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. Let's make sense of how our brains can better interpret the world around us. Bob, how are you?
I'm amused because your podcast is practically the name of my course at Berkeley. I teach a course called Sense Making and Organizing. So
Yeah.
I'm pretty well positioned to help you make sense of stuff.
Yeah, well, as I said, you've brought so many students under your umbrella over the past 20 years. Do you, including myself, do you have any idea of how much impact you've had on their different careers?
Oh, sure. I still have a pretty good network of former students from Berkeley. I like going out drinking with it because it helps me feel younger. Right? And I get to catch up on the post-popular memes and things like that.
Yeah, well, you used to take us wine tasting, and that made me feel older and more sophisticated because I was 22 at the time. So
Barely
we
legal.
we appreciate it. So to make sense, listeners, I changed the format of today's episode to ensure we have time to touch on a variety of topics. So we're not doing a crystal ball prediction segment. We're going to do a few kind of 7 to 10 minute shallow dives into topics at the intersection of cognitive and behavioral science, so that people part, and technology. So you ready, Bob? All right,
That's
so
right.
let's start with the course you teach at Berkeley. It's undergraduate course, right?
Yes.
So this
I,
podcast is Make Sense, and your course is titled Sense Making and Organizing. How
that's
does
right.
sense making and organizing affect how we interact with the world around us on a daily
Well, let me
basis?
tell you why the course exists. It exists because when I joined the cognitive science program in 2017, I was struck with the fact that it was a program and not a department, which meant that instead of there being a coherent kind of set of courses that were focused to do cognitive science as a discipline, it was basically the students were told as a major, take some course from psychology, take some from linguistics, take some from philosophy, take some from computer science, and somehow it'll all come together as cognitive science. Now, there is Cog Sci 1, but other than that, there's almost nothing that's cognitive science per se.
Interesting.
And so my goal was to put together a course which would glue together all those different disciplines. And I thought that the concepts of sense making and organizing were the ones that would do that, because those are activities that involve perception, psychology, language, philosophy, data science. So I designed a course that would do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the course does solve that problem as a curricular goal. But the more I've taught it, the more I've realized that I have a bigger problem to solve. And that is that most people aren't very good at this stuff. They pay any attention to the world around them. I say my course is about how do you discover and post structure on all of your experiences. It's a pretty broad mandate. And people don't do that. I mean, they go to work every morning or go to school every morning, and they do their routines, but they don't notice the world around them very much.
Right.
And so part of what I want people to do is to learn to pay attention to that stuff. So for example, you go to work in the morning and you didn't die. You got there safely to your office or your school. Why? Because there are stoplights and street lights and crosswalks and bike lanes and sidewalks and every manner of thing that creates an organizing system for your neighborhood on the way to work. You only
Yeah.
notice it when there's a traffic jam because there's a light out or something like that. But normally you just don't pay attention to that.
You
And the
only
problem
notice it when
with
when yeah.
technology is making this problem worse because now instead of walking to work or whatever it is, you have your phone in your face.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I go crazy when I'm walking around the campus and I see people with phones. I said, "This is the most beautiful campus. It has 200 kinds of tree species. Will you put your damn phone down and look at the trees and stuff?" This is
Mm-hmm.
driving me crazy.
Yeah.
So my goal is to give people a reason to see the benefits of paying attention to the world around them. That's part of what
Mm-hmm.
it's about. Pay attention.
Now, I remember when I took your course on information organization and retrieval at the School of Information, uh, and it broke down this black and white worldview that I had coming out of 4 years of studying engineering, right? Because you said, people are generally bad at this, right? And what you said is like, people are subjective. They have words to call, like, we have too many words to call the same things, right? Like, I will always remember address line one versus street address line one, street address line two, and all of this mismatch in the way that we talk about things and call things makes it hard for computers that are quite binary to kind of help us in support our subjectivity, right?
Right. I
Yeah.
have a new slogan that I teach my students. I say, "Friends don't let friends model it alone."
Okay, that's not new because
Not, I used to
you
do
were
that.
saying that 20 years
I thought it
ago.
was a relative new invention in my rep.
We definitely were saying that. when,
It's like when you ask people what kind of words you use to describe this object, this cup, or this whatever it is, they're surprised that they have different words.
Mhm.
Because that's because you have your own biases. Everything you do is biased. Every category you make is this bias. Every choice of words you make is biased. And people just don't realize that. So part of what I'm trying to do is to give people an awareness and kind of a cognitive toolkit for seeing the world in a different way. To say there's structure out there in your experience. Discover it, learn how to talk about it, communicate about it, and reuse it. The big
Mhm.
thing is reusing it. There's patterns of organizing. Learn to reuse them.
Right. Because as you reuse them, one, everyone becomes familiar with those patterns, which means they become easier to use. Right. And then it offers scalability. So I think one of the examples I go is like, a lot of Ford trucks still have the gear shift behind the steering wheel. And a lot of, but most cars have the gear shift in the middle of your car in the console. And if you get into a car with the gear shift up here, it takes a moment for you to realize it and figure it out and remember how to use that thing. And that's why using consistent patterns and not reinventing the wheel every time is good when you're thinking, especially about designing solutions.
When you say reinventing the wheel, you got to remember that the steering wheel is a nice standardization too. We could be steering the car with our feet.
Oh,
If
okay. Was that a
right?
thing? I don't know.
Well, I mean, steering wheel is a pretty good invention. That says we should all steer the wheel with our hands, steer the car
Right,
with our hands.
right.
That was
We're
that was a
not using
mistake.
joysticks or like video game
Yeah,
controllers to drive around.
exactly, exactly. I mean, we have choices, and that we make choices often without thinking about the consequences for interoperability or that kind of thing.
Yeah, well, in applying this in the world of design or for the audience in the way they experience things, if you're putting something out there and your emphasis is on unique experience, that may come with the consequence of it being hard to use and hard to figure out for your audience. If for user experience and usability, uniqueness isn't necessarily a good thing. You want to use repeated patterns that people can recognize cognitively, and they can use is it called system one? I think some psychologists call it the like you don't have to think about it. You don't have to
But
consciously think
see, I think you've already gotten ahead of yourself in the sense that I tell people you need to think of organizing as a design problem.
about
You
it.
don't say, I'm building a library, I'm building a warehouse, I'm building some kind of thing that already has a canonical name in your culture.
Mm.
You say, I'm solving a problem where I have to decide what am I organizing, for what purpose, for whom,
For
according to
whom?
what principles. You ask these more fundamental questions. You say, who are you doing it for? I
Right.
often ask people, you are a designer, you go into a company to pitch a project. Who are you selling to?
Right.
And of course, the designers all go, I'm selling to those smart people in the room. I'm going to convince the designers that I need my help. And I go, you should be selling to the checkbook.
Mm.
Who wants this thing done? Who's going to pay for it?
Yeah.
You should focus. That's your customer, the person with the checkbook. The
100%.
design comes after that. You got to first have the project to do, and then you work with what it does.
Yeah.
Sell the project first, and then do it. And they're going, wow. And I
Oh,
built 2 consulting firms. I know how to sell stuff. You have to make
yeah.
the money to sell stuff, that we don't have business.
Yeah. So why is sense making and organizing an important topic for students and the future workforce?
Because you have to pay attention to what's around you, because that's what's shaping what you're supposed to do in life. What are you
Mhm.
trying to build? Well, what are the affordances of the world around you that you have to be accommodating? What are the constraints? Okay, so you said I want to design a library, but no, you've already begged the question. What is a library? A library is a collection of resources that you can borrow and bring back.
Mhm.
It could be a bookmobile
Mhm.
on wheels that goes off and drives to some remote city and comes back. If you aren't paying attention to what the constraints are, the fact that there's this remote place that's a long way from other places, you'll build a building that they can't get to. Okay,
Right.
so ask the question: what are really the requirements and constraints of the problem you're trying to solve? It's too easy just to jump into the designer mode. And I mean, one of my great I always ask is, hey, it's January. You have a lot of people make resolutions in January. How many want to get organized? And my course is about organized. How many want to get organized as a result of my course? Everyone raised their hand. I said, well, how would we go about doing that? And there are usually a handful of people that say, I went to Costco and bought 6 big boxes last night, those big container boxes. I said, you're already assuming that the solution is the problem of containers.
Right.
Maybe you're trying to do the wrong thing. That's the implementation layer. Solve the logical problem first, and then implement the problem. Wow. It's like, you know, they're so used to thinking of the physical layer, the implementation layer. And I teach them to think abstractly about the problem of organizing.
Yeah. So actually, this kind of reminds me of an example or storyline that I use a lot to help people slow down at the beginning of, an innovation project to frame the problem. Is that when we are confronted with a problem, we feel some anxiety, however big or small that anxiety is, and we want it to go away. So we jump to the first solution that comes to mind. And in the startup world, that first solution usually isn't anything innovative. That's why we have so many travel and food and event apps that solve a
Right.
problem the same way. Um, but there's a quote from Albert Einstein that says, I'm not that I'm smarter, I just stuck with the problem longer. And so instead, we want to sit with that agita and analyze the problem for much longer, because we're bound to, what you said is like, find what I call the most valuable problem, the real MVP. Everyone in Silicon Valley talks about the minimum value, viable product. The most valuable problem is the one that if you solve it, will have a cascade effect and solve all the other littler problems too.
No,
So,
again, I agree completely. Again, part of the problem again is that people are so eager to solve the problem that they are seducing to solving the problem the way they already know how to solve it, something
right,
they've already done. But as a consultant, I learned that if you say, "Oh, I've done that before," they said, "Well, then it should be cheap to do it if you've done it before. I don't have to pay you very much."
right,
What you want to do is say, "You have a really interesting problem here. I've never worked on this specific problem, but I worked on a lot of problems in the same general area, and I can apply different experiences, different solutions that are related to give you a more robust solution.
hmm,
Because I could charge you more for that because I'm
right,
building a better solution." But it means you have to pause and say, let me see if I can find some analogies to other solutions that can apply here. I talked about that's called the white space problem. If I say
Mm,
I'm going to build you a library is a cluster of design decisions that's canonical. We call it a library.
right.
A museum is another cluster of design decisions called a museum. But there's things that are in between libraries and museums. And if you just
Mhm.
tag the question, oh, it's a library or a museum, you'll never get to that place. Okay?
Right. All right. So how do you think of how do you tell your students so that, the listeners here, one example of understanding sense making and organizing is looking at the systems that actually do work in your life. What's another way or activity
Okay.
they
There,
can take
there there's
just
a couple of slogans that
start
I
understanding
beat
it?
to death in my course.
Yeah,
One of them
give it
I
to us.
call it the Shamu question.
Okay.
So I'll say, have you ever seen Shamu? And they go, yeah, I saw Shamu at SeaWorld when I was a kid. The trained orca whale that jumped. I said, well, okay. And I saw it in Orlando. And I said, well, actually, there's been 38 Shamus performing at SeaWorld in the last 20 years.
Right.
Okay. Because when they die, they just rename the next one Shamu because they don't want to throw away the Shamu swag and they'll be just shot.
Right.
But more generally, the question is, are you talking about an instance or a class of something? If I say, you can buy that at Home Depot, and there's probably a drawer full of things and they're all interchangeable. If I say you can see that at the Metropolitan Museum, I'm referring to that which is a unique thing.
Hmm.
And too often people just don't even clarify that decision. Okay. So if you treat things the same, you have an easier organizing problem. If everything's different, it's much harder. Okay. So again, example I use, it's a very concrete example, but you can remember, I say, if you drive down Interstate 5 from San Francisco to Los Angeles, you pass by in a town called Coalinga, the Harris Cattle Ranch. There are 500,000 cows at this ranch. It's the world's biggest cattle ranch. Okay. They only have 2,000 employees because they can treat all the cows essentially the same, right?
Hmm.
San Francisco Zoo has 2,000 animals, has 500 employees. The ratio is staggeringly different between employees and animals because all the animals are different in the zoo. They're treated different diets, different
Right.
habitats, all these things. And so if you say, oh, everything can be, there's one kind of giant class and everything's the same, the problem is easier than if it's treats everything this different.
Easier, but it's less likely that the solution actually solves the problem.
No, but it depends on what the problem really is, though. Are you overbuilding the solution? So, okay, here's an intimate question. I want you to imagine your sock drawer, Lindsay.
Okay.
In your sock, do you have every pair of socks rolled up Marie Kondo style, one pair at a time, perfectly organized? Or do you have like a bunch of whites and a bunch of blacks and you pick some and grab the sock?
I have each sock with its pair and a little bag of the single socks.
Okay,
And
so you made a zoo in your sock drawer.
I made
You
a
did all
zoo.
this work to make a zoo in your sock drawer. Everything's treated differently. If you said they're all just white and black, it would be so much easier. You wouldn't have to sort your clothes as much, right?
My brain would hate it though,
Well,
because
obviously that's your preference, but you made that decision about whether it's a cow or a cattle ranch or a zoo. So I
yeah,
could ask you in your kitchen, where's the cows in your cattle ranch in your kitchen?
the
We have
spice
many
rack,
instances of the same
probably.
thing.
The
Many
spice
instances of the same treated the same way. It's your silverware drawer. That's a cattle
silverware,
ranch.
they all
No,
just yeah.
Spice Ranch is more of a zoo where there's one of each different thing.
Okay. All right. Okay, I see. So plates, silverware, glasses.
Yeah, some things are you don't study them. Which plate is this? Which
Right.
instance of the plate? They're all the same plate.
Okay. Cool.
So that's another slogan, the Shamu question, or you could say, did you see Santa Claus at the mall this Christmas? Well, there's 100,000 malls that have Santa Claus, but of course, anyone will do, right? For the answer to that question, yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it is that the complexity of the solution is based on truly understanding the problem. There are
Yes.
certain cases where the solution can be straightforward, but 9 times out of 10, it would be best if we just slowed down to think through that before we slapped a solution.
Answer those design questions. What are you trying to organize? Why are you trying to organize it? For whom are you trying to organize it? By what means are you trying to organize it? I mean, what are
Yeah.
the principles? It's like, and those principles, it's a cognitive toolkit. I say, here is a repertoire of ways of organizing stuff that's pretty
Okay.
generic. By their physical properties like color, shape, size, but do they have a chronological stamp on them? Do they have are they alphabetically so you can sort them?
Yeah.
You can you can alphabetize anything that has a name, okay?
Yeah. Some
But other
people want to
things,
organize their bookshelf by color,
yeah,
and other
yeah.
want to do
Or you
it
could
by
say,
size.
but
Yeah.
animals in the zoo you have to organize a little bit more sophisticated by their like habitats and their diets and things like that. They're not quite as easy as sorting books or
Hmm.
you know, spices,
So
right?
you also adapted these concepts in a book for children, right? Called Organizing for Kids. What can you
Yep.
tell us about?
Well, it was funny because I got bored during the pandemic, like a lot of us did. And I got this request from a director of a gifted and talented school program for fifth and sixth graders back east, and he says, "I love your book. Will you adapt it to my kids?" And I said, "Oh, come, you haven't read my book. It's a college textbook." And he holds it up and, "Whoa, you actually have my book." And he says, "It's a really critical time for kids in that fifth to sixth grade because they're making the transition from elementary school where they have one teacher who manages their life to basically having to manage their life with six different teachers and take more responsibility. And we don't do that very well. But if the kid doesn't make that transition, develop good skills, they'll have a very unsatisfying life.
Yeah, they'll have a harder time, right?
Right, exactly. And so I said, "Well, no, I'll try it." And I adapted this book to sixth graders, and it actually worked out fine. I developed some Zoom lectures, and then I made it into a book, which is freely available. I'm sure you could put the
I'll put it
uh,
in the show notes. Yep.
yeah. Um, but again, it's part of what was fun was that in doing so, I actually had to ask myself, what kind of examples are going to make sense to a fifth and sixth grader? Okay.
Okay, so give us some
And so, for
examples.
example, this thing about the cattle ranch at the zoo, that never was in my college class.
Ah,
Not that was an example I invented for the kids, and then I kind of syllabus back propagated it to my college course. When I
right.
realized it makes sense, it's like, why don't I use the simplest example that makes sense?
Well, that's the point of this podcast. I think over the years in this industry, uh, the examples and the information have been overly complex, which have caused a lot of misunderstanding and dashed hopes and expectations. And there are ways to explain it to fifth and sixth graders. It's actually an activity I would give founders is please explain your business like you would to a 5-year-old and explain it to like you would to your grandmother. And then we will come somewhere in between for your investors and your customers. But you best believe if a 5-year-old or a grandmother can understand it, then everyone else will too.
No, that's right. That's been really gratifying to see that there were things I could do for sixth graders would actually made sense to college kids. But I was also surprised pleasantly that some of my concepts that made sense for college kids, I could actually use them as is and make sense for sixth graders. So, for example, a very famous concept in philosophy is Plato's idea of finding natural kinds in the world through carving nature at the joints. So he says, how do you know what species of animals are? What are different species? It's because they have clusters of shared properties. So the birds are different from fish because most birds have wings and most birds fly and most birds have feathers and most fish are underwater and most they have scales and so on. So they have different properties which carves nature cleanly between these two categories of things.
That's
Okay?
basic cognitive science, right? We
Yes,
like to
yes,
categorize things.
yes. But the kids got that. I give the pictures and say, find the categories in these 10 pictures of animals. And they did. I said, what you just did, how'd you do it? Well, the ones that have shared features and they could talk about it in Plato terms. I was stunned.
Right.
So, at times when I get to sort of down propagate Plato to sixth graders, it's sort of a lot of fun to do that. So
Yeah,
again,
like
it's like
you're
trying to adapt pretty sophisticated concepts to sixth graders. Like, for example, one of the challenges is managing time. Okay. And I think the breakthrough for me was realizing that time is both a thing to manage and a principle of managing it. So we can say you can organize things chronologically, or you can also organize your time. And that having that cleanly separated made a big help for the students because they often didn't clearly distinguish those. But again, it's like, what is the concept of the same time? That's that Shamu question.
yeah.
You could say, well, they have to be there at the same time. That could mean the same moment in like milliseconds or seconds. We could say The dinosaurs were evolving at the same time the continents were breaking up. That was a 100 million year window of the same time.
That's what I was gonna say. Like, right. So same time is relevant.
Yeah, so you have to learn to pay attention to the words people use and say, when they say same time, what I'm really saying. Am I saying seconds or like, you know, paleo, the Jurassic period? Okay,
Plus
those are
or
time
minus.
periods. The second one of them is 300 million years. Okay,
Right.
and kids get that if you sit there and say, this is Shamu again. What things are being treated as the same thing? Is it all time is the same, or we can break it up in very small pieces?
So how did these concepts help them now that they have six different teachers?
Well, the basic idea is that anything is better than what they were getting. I mean, if you look at, I'm sorry, but if you have a 10-year-old kid in your life and you think the kid's not organized, you look for books to buy. They say things like, "Don't put all your books in your book pack; it'll be too heavy to carry." It's like, what do you do to solve that problem? You say, let me sort my things into categories based on things I need today for which classes. So I'm thinking about the organization of your book bag in a way which is isomorphic to the organization of your school day. Instead of saying, don't put your book bag too full, you say, here's how you think of the problem to make it solvable.
Right.
Practical
There's
skills rather than sort of vapid, advice like, don't make your book bag too full and don't leave it in your locker of the weekend or the sandwich will smell on Monday morning.
the two things. Right. Well, one is it's the way they're the one way of don't put too much in your book bag is just like a rule, and you don't know why, and you don't understand how to apply it in certain situations. And that's something that came up with one of my past guests, the behavioral scientist Matt Waller. There's a lot of frustrations that I have with how the world is organized right now, and it's actually because education wise, I studied engineering, and everything I studied concept wise, I had to understand in order to apply it because there was so much applied work. But a lot of our curriculum out there is not applied. It's about like, the thing, and you can regurgitate the thing. But if you have
Oh, Lindsay, you are
practice,
so dead on. I mean, one of the challenges now as being a professor is that especially I should name names of universities that I happen to know a lot about, but some places have enormous classes of undergrad. There could be 2,000 students in one class.
yeah, it's too
It
much.
used to be 1,000 in a giant lecture hall, but then they were able to go on Zoom, so they could double the size of the class because it's now on Zoom.
Hmm.
Right? In a class that big, you're teaching data science one or whatever it's called. Everyone's taking that one class now. I mean, there's no incentive to try to actually engage in any intellectual way. It's more like, how can I pass the exam to move on to the next course? And it's like you have this real sense of my job is to learn what the professor says.
Hmm.
And so I've gone from having relatively sparse lecture notes, and now I basically hand the students a transcript practically of my lecture. Here's 50 slides from my hour lecture. I said,
Hmm.
don't read them. Read them before the lecture, and then just listen in class and engage. You don't have to be a typing robot taking notes. Think about what I'm saying.
Hmm.
I often like to say things that sound kind of serious, and then pause and say, "Did you understand what I just said?"
Hmm.
So I'll say, "That's an important semantic distinction," and I'll stop and pause and say, "Can someone define semantic?"
Hmm.
And they go, "Oh, come on, semantics is the study of meaning." I said, "So what does meaning mean?"
Hmm.
And they go, "Oh, he's doing it again. Damn it."
That's your
Okay.
philosopher.
Basically say we don't
I
move
get
on to
mad at
like
that
understand
question
this stuff. I mean, again, it's too easy in a large Zoomified environment to just sit there and remember what the definition was
right.
and not understand a damn thing. And I just refuse to do that because I don't
Yeah,
need
no,
this. I
and
want
it's probably one of
to.
the reasons I've always liked, I liked working with you is like a commitment to higher standards, right? And higher quality. Just and what's going to have in practically better outcomes. One thing I wanted to do is pull back the kind of circle back to the organizing concept of putting like things together and organizing them in a way to solve a problem. uh, the make sense audience, the easiest thing is like if you're looking at a to-do list and it's not organized by priority or by topic or by activity, it can be really hard to context switch from one thing to the next. But if you're like, out of these 20 items, these are the 6 phone calls I have to make, and you put those all together and make those 6 phone calls, then it's far easier than going through an unorganized to-do list. And so that's why it's good to have, but I have multiple different organizing schemes depending on
Of
what needs
course,
to
of
be
course.
accomplished.
I'm amused. I'm laughing now because that stuff isn't in my college course. I assume that if you made it to college, you had sufficient organized skills to survive at least some of those problems. So I never taught time management and things like that in my organizing classes with college kids.
Yeah,
But,
well, if you want someone to come in, or I would be happy to do that because
but for my kids' book, I actually have a methodology for making your schedule and prioritizing. And it was fun to actually think about that for the first time in my life, where I actually systematize stuff that I always took for granted
yeah, I
because
would
the students I
challenge
had
you
in
that your
Berkeley presumably could like make it to class on time at least.
I would challenge you that your college students could use like how do we apply organizing our to-do lists in different ways
Well,
because
I agree. I'm sure they can because, in fact, again, you can never. Again, I don't want to use the word Berkeley. I'm sure many college kids, and regardless of where they go to school, have this same problem that especially in the pandemic, they lost a lot of, or they lost a chance to develop certain kinds of skills as students,
Mhm,
as social organisms, as attention-paying organisms. They just sort of sat there with their laptop in front of their face and they did the best they could.
mhm.
So I like doing activities in my class and before my class as assignments, just to sort of change that MO. So I have a lecture coming up on folk biology and folk classification, how different cultures look at the world differently. And the assignment they have is to say, here is a map. It's called the Tree Walk at Berkeley that was put together by the Forestry Department. Walk around and look at these trees. Follow the map for half an hour and look at these trees and come to class and tomorrow we'll talk about it. I give them all the instructions I give them. Okay. Then I'm going to ask them when they walk into class, I said, how do trees differ? What properties distinguish trees? And they'll have some ideas now. They've never thought of this before, but how they're kind of classify trees. And then I'll say, okay, here are 20 names of trees, 20 names of plants. 10 of them are tree names. Which ones are the tree names? And they'll get like 5 of them right.
Mhm.
Okay. And then I'll say, and of course, some of them were on the tree walk list. They just didn't look at it enough to think about it. Then I'll say, here are 10 trees. Can we name them? All of them are on the tree walk.
Mhm.
They had this paper in front of them that said what the names of them were. They will get like 4 or 5 out of 10 right. I go, you've been on this campus for 4 years and you never thought, what was the name of that tree? And the answer is like, well, why would I care? I said, because you are a human living in a physical universe, you ought to know what the world's like out there, right?
Yeah.
And they'll say, then I have the humiliation exercise. I say, okay, here's a paper that I should assign to you. It's about biological classification in the Amazon rainforest among Ecuadorian 4-year-olds. And there are 4-year-olds that can name 40 plant species. 4-year-olds.
Yeah.
If you can't name 5 and you're a college student and they can name 40, you should be embarrassed. And I just paused for a while. And they go, it's okay. Here's 10 fast food restaurants. How many can you distinguish? And they get them all, of course. It's like, kids don't joke in any of them, right? But it's like, it's about your need. But just because you don't need to have something, then you know what? Doesn't mean you shouldn't be curious a little bit. Curiosity is a good skill to have, even if it's not instrumental. Learn to pay attention just because it's enriching intellectually and personally.
Yeah. But
So I'm trying, but I mean, you find as a college professor these days, I mean, my office hours, I have drop-in office hours. I would say that 90% of the time, it's not about my course. It's about, can you give me some career advice about my life? And, what do I do with my life? It's like, okay, I'm the confessor. You have sinned. I know.
are you you're doing confessions? Okay.
Father Bob will confess your sins and will help you get on a better path to enlightenment.
Yeah. So I want to dive into the data and information organization problem more, particularly kind of closing the data gaps and overlaps. A lot of the technology experiences we have that go wrong is because the big technology systems that power our everyday don't quite talk to each other well. Now you sat on, and I don't know if you still sit on data standardization committees that basically exist to help tech giants find points of collaboration and ways to better share their data. But that was in 2006 when I knew you, and it's still very much a very present problem
Well, that's
today.
because, I mean, to be honest, you have a naive view of standards committee. In
Okay.
that,
Thanks.
while their nominal purposes to have, let's all get together and come up with with some specifications for information or data sharing that we can all use and so on. I mean,
But
I was
then,
on committees where it's like, okay, uh, IBM, Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, let's get together and organize our little infrastructure around web services or something, okay?
mhm,
Well, we want this to be completely open to the world, so let's invite anyone that can come, you know, and we'll have meetings that all over the world so people can come to the one that's close to them. So let's meet in Tokyo, and then 3 months later meet in Berlin, and 3 months later meet in London, and 3 months later meet in San Jose. Realistically, who can afford to go to those meetings? IBM, SAP, Sun, Oracle,
mhm.
Microsoft. So it's like the club pretends it's open, but it's actually open in principle, but in fact, because of the economics, it's not really an open standards group.
Got
So most standards don't really work because they're intended really to be a closed club, even though they're pretending they're an open club. They're really trying to build a cartel, not an open standard. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
That's my confession of the night.
I mean, I like that, and that's probably also one of the reasons why we haven't seen a ton of progress. One of the uh, one of the examples that came up last year, I had a doctor on, and we were talking about how electronic medical record systems are really designed for billing insurance, not for patient care and doctor care. And when we talk about AI taking our jobs, which is all over the media, or AI robots treating us in doctors' offices, a really big boulder to get over is that these electronic medical records don't want to make their data available to train these things, nor is the data that clean or great. And they see making their data available as, or keeping their data private as a competitive advantage.
That's because it
So,
was designed to make insurance work, not to make healthcare better. I mean,
right,
that was the motivation. Again, who's paying the bills for that work?
right.
Okay. Look at. I mean, there's a book that you should have all your acolytes read called Recoding America. You ever heard of this book, Recoding America?
No, I haven't, but
Her name is Jen Palka is the author of it. She founded Code for America.
okay.
And she wrote this brilliant book a couple of years ago called Recoding America, which basically says we need to fix the way government runs because there's this huge gap between policy intent and implementation. So
100%.
the problem is that people in Washington or the bodies of the making laws passed this law that says we want there to be a big infrastructure bill and encourage the development of new highways and new this and that and stuff. But we're done. Congratulate ourselves on making this great law. In the implementation phase, well, that's the grunt work of making it work. But that work is viewed as beneath them.
Hmm.
That's some kind of contractor's job to actually write the implementation specs and stuff. And there's proliferation and it's not coordinated. So there's like 300 different programs to apply for with non interoperable websites to get money from this grant to actually fix things. So there's been very little money spent for that infrastructure bill because the interfaces to get the money are so broken. Okay.
Mm,
And likewise, there's this, our government systems, a lot of them are really badly built. They were built by huge contractors at big blobs rather than incrementally by agile methods and say. And so we have a problem. Let's update this system. So let's have another gigantic contract to build another layer on top of the old broken one.
hmm.
It's having layers and layers of systems which try to fix the broken layer below them, but then have another level of complexity.
Yeah.
And so the systems are just impossibly
But so here's the thing,
okay.
Bob, is that like one, my heart hurts that these problems still exist because we were talking about these problems when I was a student with you 20 years ago. And and yeah, I can see on your face, so for anyone listening, he feels similarly that it's frustrating. But like For instance, I did a huge project for health insurance claims processing, and it was so obvious that the client was only clearing 65% of their health insurance claims. They were only getting paid on 65% because despite there being a national provider ID and standardized diagnostic codes, they were billing to 750 payers, and at least 50% of them had some custom requirements if you wanted to get paid by the insurance company. And so we have these insurance companies who, rather than invest in updating their own back end infrastructure, push the onus onto hospital systems, which is why here in Philadelphia, Temple University lost $80 million rolling out the electronic medical record system in their hospital, right? And so sometimes that's when I come to like, should we just burn it all down, right? Does
I
this
think we could do a lot of, we could do some, there's probably more good to be done than bad to be done by burning a lot of it down. I mean, the stories in California about uh, the COVID unemployment insurance problem. We, after the COVID thing, we said people get laid off. Let's give them uninsurance benefits, and let's make it really easy to get those benefits.
Mhm.
So they had these a hastily built website. You allegedly would fill out a form, and if you match some back end database that had a name and number in it, you'd get your check.
Mhm.
The problem is that it was asked so many questions and so complicated that most normal people might put their middle name in instead of instead of an initial, or they would misspell their address street, or they might have a slight permutation with the social security number or something like that. So instead of saying, "Oh, well, we should fix this," it didn't match. They put it in like "fix it later" pile.
Mhm.
Okay, and there was like a year backlog. Okay, in the meantime, crime gangs in prisons and stuff said, let's steal all this data that's authoritative and create fake people that matches those names. Okay, and if we can match those names exactly, we got to check. So the California spent billions of dollars in fake benefits to people that were basically had stolen the authoritation the system for authentication. So you
Mm.
have perfectly good applications which are basically fraudulent, and real people got screwed because they made slight mistakes in the user interface, which is too complicated. Terrible
So
stories.
to bring it back to what we were talking about, part of it is because people don't take the time to think through the problem that they're solving before they launch the organizing scheme and solution, right? Um, the other thing that I thought would help us, you're shaking your head, so people
Well,
listen.
again, it's like I've actually done some research. I read the story of this pretty because I was so incensed by it. In
Yeah.
California, the person who was running this unemployment division was told by the legislature, we got to give people benefits. And she was told by her people, it's going to take a month to build a credible system and so on and so on. And the legislature said, I want it done now.
Yeah.
So they deliberately built a broken, simplistic system to get something up and running rather than say it'll take a month to do this right or 2 months to do it even better. Because it was easier to say, I did what you asked me to do, even if it failed, than to say, I tried to do something better, but was not what you asked me to do. So the
So
basic CYA mode was more important than help the users out.
right. So or save the state some money and direct the money to the right place. Um,
Yes,
Nothing
yes.
bothers me more when something like takes longer and is mediocre in a solution and really expensive. And that seems to happen a lot in tech. And there are kind of two things. A past guest of mine, Ronnie Batista, business design consultant for a long time, he said, at least in corporate, IT is the metric they achieve is like roll the system out, get the system implemented, instead of their incentive being like sales contracts should close 10% faster in the next year. So
How
instead of
about, how about did you solve the user's problem as the objective function rather than
right.
did you ship the thing?
So the takeaway is not to like your goals should be around the behavioral incentive.
Yes.
And that goes back to my other guest, Matt Waller, who talked about how modern product development teams, they don't take the time to define what behavior are we trying to change in the customer? What are we trying to get them to do? Rather than just launch this budget feature, launch this whatever feature it is, right? So now, Bob, you are interested in bringing academia and industry closer together, particularly in this field of behavior science. So what do what do you want to learn from what's going on in industry? You said you keep in touch with a lot of your former students. Like, what are you hoping to get
Yeah.
back from them? And
What's really frustrating is that there has been this sort of bifurcation over the last few decades between industry and the academy, especially in behavioral science, because it wasn't that long ago that we had these huge industrial research labs at Bell Labs and at GE and DuPont and IBM that were doing a lot of important work in pure research and also in applied research that was solving real problems. But in the last few decades, companies have sort of downsized all that, and we just buy technology, we buy companies into this, so they're doing less R&D in the companies, and so as a result, there's just less industry-focused research being done at that scale.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, universities have gotten, in a lot of fields, gotten much more interested in focusing on, well, did you publish 10 papers this year to get tenure
Smelling
rather
their
than
own
just
farts. They just
problems, right?
are much more interested in smelling each
Yeah.
other's farts
So
than
again, this
being relevant.
we call this the culture, the problem of the culture of credit. Okay, if I'm a university professor, I get more rewards by publishing papers that no one reads than by solving a real problem. Okay, and if I moonlight on 20% of the time in industry, people think, well, you're just trying to make some extra money on the side. I mean, as opposed to maybe I want to solve more interesting problems out there, right? And vice versa. If you Lindsay Tabus, podcast perfect person with a great following and podcast, okay? If you were a professor doing this, they say, you're such a dilettante, wasting time. You should be doing more papers instead of trying to be a popularizer. That's not important work to popularize your science. And that's totally wrong. So I like to find ways to say, let's learn to share and be on the same team again, especially in some of the important problems you're solving now, the amount of scale that industry can bring to a problem is qualitatively different than out of the academy. So I have a friend who runs the data science prediction group at Netflix. You know, they're solving problems in kind of continuous prediction that are really important. That, like, if you're at Netflix and you watch a movie and you turn it off, they should have learned something, right? Because you didn't like what they recommended. It's an important question, okay?
Mm-hmm.
And they have 100 times more data than any professor in a lab would have in industry, in academia, okay? And those people want the data, but people who work in the academy says, I don't want to be seen going to Netflix and asking for data. That kind of is beneath me. It's like, really?
Well,
it's really messed up.
Actually, to call back to a shared experience we mentioned before we pressed record is that, when I was doing research under you, we were collaborating with IBM Research to develop new, I think, more relevant academic programming for training the next generation of our workforce in service system design and management. And it did not help that the media caught wind of this and thought IBM should have no place in influencing academic subjects. And now, 20 years later, we have a real skills gap between what kids are learning at the university and what the job market actually needs. And that's another really large frustration I have in following, technology as it's grown.
Well, here's the sad coda to that story. There are probably no departments of service science right now in the universities. There's one attempt that's really important. Paul Magla, who was at IBM Research at the time, who was one of the people working with us to help develop service science at Berkeley, is now at the University of California, Merced, as one of the heads in the business school, trying to develop a school of complex systems by merging cognitive science, political science, economics, and kind of business stuff to create would solve relevant problems of scale that are important to California, you know, jobs in the Central Valley, skill sets for the new technologies of the future, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
It's being stonewalled by siloed departments saying, well, then you'll take away resources from psychology and philosophy. And really, they're trying to defend their disciplinary turf at the expense of creating this much bigger, you know, much more relevant, much more should be much more important kind of enterprise. But the
Yep.
academy is full of people that are fighting these
The,
stovepipe battles.
the human ego is a remarkable obstruction to better innovation. Like,
Um,
you know,
yeah, that's a nice way to put it.
the human ego. No, but if you think about it, and I want to make it make sense for our audience as we wrap up, when we face a problem and come up with a solution really quickly, we are using our personal frame of reference, which is very egocentric, instead of slowing down to think about who are we designing for and how can we get into their mindset and come up with a solution for them, right? So when we feel kind of, greedy, selfish, want to cover our butts like the government in California did with the benefits, we don't get the best outcomes. We really do not get the best outcomes in terms of really solving the problem and with efficiency.
Well, you know, I'm struggling with it. I'm trying to be optimistic in the face of all the evidence to the contrary. But Jen Palka's book did give me some hope because, as the founder of Code for America, she actually has encouraged a lot of people in like Silicon Valley to go how to work with the government to help solve government problems. And they did manage to start uh, the government digital service, for example, kind of
Yeah,
a consulting firm inside the government
yeah,
that would help do that. So there
yeah.
is some hope.
There is
Um,
hope. I'll bring it back to a recent LinkedIn post of mine, where John Oliver, who actually is the one that said he wanted to burn everything down, the critical comedian and host of Last Week Tonight with John Oliver, he was asked, "Hey, don't you get really pessimistic and like beat up and discouraged doing all this research?" And he says, "Yes, he does. He wants to burn everything down." But inevitably, he also realizes that there are a lot of good intentioned people making incremental change that does matter. And that's where the audience for this show comes in, because we've learned a bunch of really great takeaways, and are reminded of these really great takeaways of, slowing down to understand the problem, noticing the environment around you, and taking that time to come up with the best solution. So,
look
do
for
you
the
have
white space. Look for the white space. Don't just
look for
assume
the
the
white
problem
space?
has a.
All
Yeah.
right. So, thank you for listening to Make Sense with me, your host, Lindsay Tabus, and guest, Bob Glushko, Professor Bob Glushko. We hope you enjoyed our take on sense making and organizing the information and world around us. Bob, do you want people to find you online? And if so, where?
I'm not really an online person these days, but they can find my books. If they look for my books, they can find them for free at Berkeley on the Pressbook site, which you should put out the link on.
Yeah, we'll put
Both.
in the show notes his books. I still got your copy of Document Engineering on my bookshelf. So, as always, you can find all those links and resources in the show notes. Final note: if you want to continue to be the smartest person in the room, make sure you're getting notified when each episode hits. On YouTube, you'll hit subscribe, and for audio only, follow wherever you get your podcasts. Thank you, Bob, for joining me.
Thank you for having me.